Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 275 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Yes, hold on a second, I'm getting to that. And that was Sprocket, my co-host for this episode. Okay, see, Sprock, I did it. I introduced you. Now, Sprocket joins me today, mostly behind the scenes, because today's episode is about pets and the practice of pet keeping in early America. It's an episode that was inspired by you. You've been asking to know more about pets in early America, so my digital audio team teammates and I used your request as an opportunity to create a new type of episode. It's a format we're calling Ask a Historian. So we asked you for your questions about pets in early America, and then we used your questions as the foundation, or scaffolding, if you will, around which we built this entire episode. And after that, we then went out and found a historian who could answer your questions. Ingrid Tague, a professor of history at the University of Denver and author of the book Animal Companions, Pets and Social Change in 18th-Century Britain. Now, among the questions Ingrid will answer, where and when did the practice of keeping pets originate? How did the tradition of pet keeping in Great Britain and early America begin? And why did early Americans choose to keep pets? And what were the different types of pets that early Americans chose to keep? But first, what does the United States mean by equality? What does and has it intended by its statement, all men are created equal? The United States has long held the idea of equality as one of its founding principles, and its ideas about equality in terms of social, economic, and political opportunities have changed a lot over time. On Wednesday, June 10 at 5:30 p.m. Eastern, the Omohundro Institute will be hosting a live conversation with historians Daniel Mandel and Heather Cox Richardson about equality. These two scholars have just released new books on the subject of equality. Daniel Mandel's The Lost Tradition of Economic Equality in America, 1600 to 1870, and Heather Cox Richardson's How the South Won the Civil War. And the conversation we'll have with these two authors will take us through Americans' changing ideas on the principle of equality from the 1600s to the present. So, I hope you will join the OI for what I think will be a fascinating conversation on equality. This June 10th conversation is free to attend. All you need to do is register, and you can do that by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/register. That's benfranklinsworld.com/register. And with that, I hope you and your animal companions are ready, because now it's time for us to meet Ingrid Tague and explore your questions about pets in early America. Today's historian joins us from the University of Denver, where she works as a professor of history. She's written 2 books, including Animal Companions, Pets and Social Change in 18th-Century Britain. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Ingrid Tague.
Thanks, it's lovely to be here.
So Ingrid, we have lots of questions about animal companions in British North America during the 18th century. And I wonder if we could start with where and when this tradition of keeping domesticated animals as pets began and originated.
Sure. There's actually a lot of evidence that says that people have been keeping pets since ancient times, really. There's some evidence from Greek and Romans that they were keeping pets, and studies of hunter-gatherer societies today have found evidence of people keeping pets in, again, extremely early kinds of human societies. So I don't think it's unusual that people kept pets. What's unusual, I think, is the sort of scale on which we see pet keeping today.
So it wasn't the case where everyone in the past had a cat or a dog or a hamster at home?
No, definitely not. It would be something fairly unusual, and certainly the way that we think about pets as having a very special status and being part of our family would not have been something that people thought about until fairly recently. So the kind of attitude toward pets is different. For example, a lot of people who keep pets in non-Western societies today might, for example, keep them as pets, but eventually end up eating them, which is something that, of course, we would never do with our pets today. We think of them as a completely different kind of category from all other kinds of animals.
Now, when did Great Britain and British North America become interested in keeping animals as pets? And was there something that was distinctive about this British tradition of keeping animal companions?
So what we really see is it's the 18th century when pet keeping happens on a really wide scale, when it moves to being something from a pastime of a fairly small number of people, and in Western Europe it would be something that would just be done by elites, to be something that almost everyone in society had or could have a pet in the way that we think about pet keeping as incredibly common today. I think the most distinct thing about pet keeping in Britain and North America generally are the first location where we really see pet keeping on a large scale in Western Europe. And that has everything to do with the fact that Britain gets richer than all the other countries pretty quickly. And that means that people can afford to keep pets in a way that a lot of other nations were unable to do until they get past widespread poverty and famine.
Now, when we talk about people keeping animals as pets, what kinds of animals are we actually talking about? Because Jeremy would like to know more about the types of animals that early Americans in Britain kept as pets and whether there were any restrictions on the animals that they could keep as pets.
So the most common pets then and now were dogs. I don't think that that's a surprise. Human beings have evolved along with dogs for thousands of years. They are our closest animal companion species and have been for a very long time. So they were the most common animal then. They're still the most common pet today. And there weren't actually any sort of legal restrictions on the kinds of pets that people could keep because pets actually didn't have any sort of legal status in this period. The only kinds of animals that had any sort of legal status were either working animals that had value because they worked or animals for food, which had value because you ate them. But because pets didn't work and weren't food, they didn't have any value. And so they actually literally had no legal status. As far as the law was concerned, they didn't exist at all. So that meant that you could keep any animal you wanted to as a pet. Again, most common were dogs. Some kind of unusual pets from our point of view today would be squirrels were actually really popular as pets in the 18th century. And cats were a lot less popular as pets than they are today because cats had a really bad reputation until fairly recently.
Teresa has a question about how early Americans acquired their animal companions. So, were there any pet shops, breeders, or pet adoption shelters in early America or in 18th century Great Britain?
So you start to see the first pet shops opening around the 1760s in British North America. And that comes along with the rise of shops in general during this period where we get a consumer culture that's fairly new in this period. So you could get animals there. Most of those kinds of shops that would sell animals would specialize in exotic animals. So things that would be kept in menageries as opposed to mostly traditional pets. They'd often sell some dogs and things like that, but most of those shops were dedicated to monkeys, parrots, more exotic animals. The most common way for people to acquire pets was actually for them to be given as gifts in an era when nobody spays or neuters their animals. There were always plenty of them to go around. Or for people to simply acquire them from the wild. Particularly, songbirds were very popular pets, and most of those would simply be captured in the wild, either directly or captured in the wild and then sold by itinerant vendors.
What did Britons and early Americans do when they were gifted or found a pet that just wasn't compatible with their family's lifestyles or their other beloved pets? Were there any societies or animal shelters for people to take these unwanted animals to?
There really weren't, and people were pretty ruthless. So the standard way of dealing with unwanted animals was to kill them, usually by drowning them. So they would literally be put in a bag and weighted down with stones and thrown into the nearest pond or river or just into a basin until they were dead. So this was not a society that had a strong sense of animal welfare or caring for animals. That said, when people had pets that they loved, if they found that they couldn't care for them, they would try and find a new home. And you very often find people, when their dogs or cats have litters, doing their best to find friends who will take those puppies or kittens, and so that those animals would have a good home.
You mentioned earlier that pet keeping was an activity for people with means, that you didn't typically see a lot of animal companions among people who were dealing with starvation and famine. So just how much money or other means did a person need to have to be able to keep and care for an animal companion?
So that would depend a lot upon the animal. And in most cases, actually, you didn't need a tremendous amount of money. So as soon as you get to a position where you have any kind of disposable income, it really becomes possible for people to have pets. So we're really talking about anyone who is off the margins of starvation would be able to keep a pet. And that's because the vast majority of pets, even dogs, would basically live on scraps. So they would get whatever it was that the humans weren't eating, leftovers, bones. Most dogs had a largely vegetarian diet, in fact, of things like bread, because that was the primary diet of most humans as well. And then, of course, dogs and cats could forage out in the streets in garbage or on vermin. Cats were kept primarily as mousers or ratters. That was seen as their primary function. And then, of course, with small animals like birds, they could just be given the leftover crumbs. And so things like songbirds were actually accessible to pretty much anyone at any social level.
Now, Stessa wonders about the different types of people who kept pets in early America and Great Britain, and why they would have chosen to keep an animal around as a companion.
Sure. I think that the most common reason why people kept pets in the 18th century was for the same reason that people keep pets today, for companionship, for entertainment, because we relate to other living animals. I think the thing that's really unusual about this period is that for a very long time, loving or caring for a pet would have been seen as almost sinful. Animals were supposed to be created for humans to use, either for labor or food. And so the notion that someone would keep an animal that doesn't do either of those things would have been seen as problematic. And so the first people who keep pets and where pets first become seen as acceptable is usually with children and with rich people who are seen as having a lot of disposable income and spending their money on pets just like they spend their money on other kinds of useless luxuries. What we see over time is that increasingly it becomes acknowledged that anyone might want to keep an animal, and it gets seen as a legitimate interest for people to love and care for a pet in the way that we do today.
Now, as we think about early America and even Great Britain in the 18th century, we know that this is a period of empire, and that when we talk about these different places, we're actually talking about lots of different peoples. So, was pet keeping isolated to white British Americans, or is the habit of keeping animal companions something that we can see among Native Americans, the enslaved, and free blacks too?
So certainly it would have been possible for enslaved people and Native Americans to keep pets. And I'll be honest, I don't know a great deal about Native American pet keeping practices. But certainly for slaves, I think it's highly likely that enslaved people did keep pets. Obviously, they wouldn't have been recognized as the owners of those animals because enslaved people were seen as property. They couldn't own property themselves. But in a strange way, this role of pets as not being legally property themselves would have in some ways given a sort of a legal loophole there. So I think it's very likely that enslaved people did keep pets and develop those kinds of emotional attachments, even though those wouldn't have been formally recognized as their possessions in the way that they would be for free people.
What about pet ownership across the different spaces and places of British North America? Because North America had cities and towns and rural communities. So did different places determine the different kinds of pets that early Americans would keep and have?
To a certain extent, people in urban areas would have been much more likely to keep very small animals. Space conditions in the same way that they do today would have affected people in the 18th century. And so keeping small animals like songbirds or small dogs would have been much more common. It's hard to keep a mastiff in a very small house or a cottage. On the other hand, people in rural America would have had more of a utilitarian attitude toward their animals, perhaps, and therefore would have been more likely to have things like hunting dogs, mastiffs, animals that would have been working, and perhaps less likely to have animals that were purely pets. Although we do see cases where people will refer to things like indoor and outdoor dogs. So the outdoor dogs would be the working dogs, the guard dogs, and the hunting dogs, while the indoor dogs would have been the smaller dogs, the lap dogs, the spaniels that would have been what we would think of as traditional pets.
Thinking about spaniels and mastiffs, one popular question that many listeners had for this episode was about different dog breeds. And Leslie would like to know if there was anything unique about American dog and horse breeds and whether 18th century Americans had a preference for a domestic breed or some sort of imported animal breed?
So in the 18th century, the concept of breed as we use it today just actually didn't exist. And there's been some good work on this that shows how in the 19th century, that idea got created, partly due to changing ideas about race and humans, to be honest. In the 18th century, people did have notions of different kinds of animals within a single species. But for dogs, for example, they would have been primarily characterized in terms of the work that they did. So there would be a distinction between terriers that were designed to dig up particular kinds of animals out of holes, as opposed to hounds that would be involved in chasing for the hunt, or mastiffs that would be used as guard dogs and the like. So when people in the 18th century talk about what we might think of today as dog breeds, they're really talking about them in terms of the purpose that they serve or the work that they do. And one of the effects of that is you'll frequently see things like lap dogs, small dogs that we would now have many, many different terms for. People would just say, well, those are all just small, useless dogs. And they would actually use the term useless as the group to describe those kinds of animals. Because again, the concept of breed wasn't what was important. What was important was what the animal actually did. So there were a sense of different roles. And we have, for example, with horses, people had placed a very high value on Arabian horses as race horses in the same way that we see sometimes today. And different horses of different sizes and shapes would be used for different purposes. But again, they didn't talk about breeds in the way that we do today. And the concept of a purebred animal that is important today really didn't exist at all at the time.
This conversation has been very helpful, and I do think it's helped us better understand traditions of pet ownership and animal companionship during the 18th century. And I do wonder whether there is something in those 18th century traditions of animal companionship that can really help us better understand our own practices of pet ownership today in the 21st century.
So I think the most important thing that happened in the 18th century for implications today is really the rise of a pet keeping culture in the way that we have a pet keeping culture today. That simply did not exist until the mid to late 18th century. And so the ways in which we actually think about pets today, that pets are really essential to our notion of a comfortable home. That's an 18th century concept. The idea that pets are part of the family is a concept that develops in the 18th century. The idea that someone who keeps pets, someone who loves animals is probably a good person, that is an 18th century concept. And so I think what's really amazing is that all of those sorts of ideas that we take for granted in our relationship with pets have a history, and that history really emerged in the 18th century. The other things is that in debates about pet keeping in the 18th century, we also see the roots of a lot of the debates that exist today. So a lot of the anxiety around pets in the 18th century had to do with this idea of them being useless luxury consumer goods, and that people were wasting time, money, and food on these useless animals. And I think those kinds of concerns still exist today when people can be very dismissive about, for example, celebrities and their purse dogs, or when we have debates about, in periods of crisis, what do we owe to pets? If we are doing emergency evacuations, for example, there are still very serious debates about whether pets are worthy of the same care and attention that humans are. And that was a debate that was very serious in the 18th century. And finally, I think the kinds of questions that we have today around pet keeping itself and the morality of pet keeping remain really important today and were very important in the 18th century. Right now, a lot of questions around pets have to do with whether or not it is legitimate to own another living being. And there are some people who have very serious questions about that. And those questions also have their roots in the 18th century when there were debates about whether or not it was acceptable to own another living being. And of course, in the 18th century, those questions were very much in the context of slavery and the enslavement of humans. And so when people talked about owning other living beings in the 18th century, they were thinking about birds that wanted to be free, but also about humans that wanted to be free. But those kinds of debates and the way that people struggle with those issues very much survived through today.
And Ingrid, before we let you go, is there something else about animal companionship in the 18th century that you find really interesting that you also think we should know about?
I think one question that emerged maybe sort of sideways from your listeners' questions is this issue of, in the 18th century, where there were genuine debates about who deserved to own a pet and under what circumstances. So even as pet keeping becomes more widespread, one of the things that we see are a lot of debates and questions opening up among individuals asking whether or not certain kinds of people should be allowed to have pets. So pet keeping in the 18th century is very much associated with women and with fashionable women. And so when people are trying to attack fashionable women, they often attack the fact that those women keep things like little useless lapdogs that they spend their money and their affection on. There are debates about whether poor people should be allowed to keep pets when they have such limited resources themselves. And I think it's really fascinating to watch as a society increasingly starts to keep pets, the ways in which attitudes toward the legitimacy of pet ownership itself change, and the ways in which questions about who deserves to own a pet actually change. From a feeling around 1700, where the dominant view was really no one should own a pet. It really wasn't appropriate for anyone, to a view by 1800 that really everyone deserved to own a pet, and that desire for emotional companionship and close connection with animals was something that was legitimate and should be celebrated.
Ingrid Tague, thank you so much for joining us and for answering our questions about pet ownership and animal companionship in 18th century British America.
Thanks. Really appreciate it. It was fun.
Humans have kept pets and animal companions for millennia because, as a species, we're hardwired to relate to other people and to other animals. So, while the act of keeping a pet may not be new to our times or to our societies, the way we look upon pets is relatively new when you think about it. As Ingrid related, pets were seen by many in early America and Great Britain as sinful luxuries. Until the mid-18th century, early Americans believed that God created animals for humans to use either for their labor or as a food source. But pets served neither of these purposes. So, what good was a dog that sat on your lap or a songbird that chirped every time you entered a room? Until the mid-18th century, these animals were seen as useless, as luxuries for the rich or as bad decisions made by the poor. But Britons began to change their views of pet keeping in the mid-18th century. At first, Britons softened their views on pets when it came to children. Then they recognized that there might be a myriad of reasons why someone might want to keep an animal as a companion. Still, early Americans didn't share the same views that we have today. Pets had no legal standing as property because they neither worked nor provided food. When people no longer wanted an animal, they just killed it, most often by drowning. And yet, we can also see Britons and early Americans in the mid to late 18th and early 19th century grappling with ideas about pet ownership that we still grapple with today. Are pets useless luxury consumer goods? Do people spend too much money on their pets? Should pets be looked upon as family members? And if they should, what do we owe pets in moments of crisis? Should firefighters spend time looking to evacuate pets in the same way that they spend time looking to evacuate humans? And then there's the even larger question pondered by early Americans. Is it right for people to own other living beings? Now, all of these questions arose in some form or another in early Americans' minds. And as they thought about how they would answer these questions, views on pet keeping in early America drastically changed over the course of a century. From the idea that no one should keep a pet in 1700 to the idea that animal companions and pet ownership was something to be celebrated by 1800. Look for more information about Ingrid, her book, Animal Companions, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/275. Don't forget to join the Omohundro Institute for a conversation on equality. This live event will take place on Wednesday, June 10 at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. It's a free event. All you need to do is register at benfranklinsworld.com/register. That's benfranklinsworld.com/register. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Behind the scenes, we also receive a lot of love, support, and assistance from our beloved animal companions. Our dogs, Ted, Clyde, and Sprocket, and America's favorite fighting betta fish, Lafayette. Finally, what did you think of this new kind of episode? Did you like the Ask a Historian format? please let me know, because what you tell us will help us determine whether we should produce more of these types of episodes. You can reach me at liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.